Why medieval tools never broke while yours. Rust and snap. Your grandfather's axe is still splitting wood. Your brand new one from the hardware store snapped at the handle last winter, and the head's already showing rust spots. You chalked it up to bad luck, maybe a defective product. But walk into any antique shop and you'll find chisels, hammers, and saws from the 1800s, 1700s, even earlier. Still sharp, still solid, still usable. Meanwhile, your socket set from 5 years ago is already missing teeth and showing corrosion. Here's the thing nobody wants to admit. We're not making better tools. We're making cheaper ones, faster ones, more profitable ones. But better? Not even close. A blacksmith in 1450 couldn't run to Home Depot for a replacement axe. When he forged a tool, that tool needed to last decades, maybe centuries. It needed to survive constant use, exposure to the elements, and pass down through generations. And it did. Archaeological digs across Europe consistently turn up medieval farming tools, carpentry equipment, and blacksmith hammers that, after some cleaning, could go right back to work. One study from the University of Bradford examined 14th century agricultural tools found in Yorkshire and found the iron was still structurally sound after 600 years in the ground. Your modern drill bits can't make it through a single renovation project without dulling. Let's talk about why. The iron problem. Medieval toolmakers worked primarily with wrought iron, not steel, not the alloy we think of today. Wrought iron, which is nearly pure iron with tiny fibers of slag running through it like wood grain. And this is where modern metallurgy guys will tell you we've advanced. Steel is stronger, they'll say. Higher carbon content means harder edges. And they're right, technically. Steel is harder. But harder isn't always better. Wrought iron has a tensile strength of about 40,000 psi. Modern mild steel clocks in around 60,000 psi. So steel wins, right? Except here's what those numbers don't tell you. Wrought iron doesn't snap. It bends. When you overload a wrought iron tool, it deforms. You can heat it up and straighten it out. When you overload modern steel, it fractures. You throw it away and buy another one. That slag I mentioned, those impurities running through wrought iron like wood grain, they create something called a fibrous structure. Hit a piece of wrought iron with a hammer, and those fibers absorb the impact, distributing stress throughout the material. Modern steel is homogeneous, uniform. Stress concentrates at the weakest point, and the whole thing fails. A blacksmith at the Tower of London Armoury analyzed medieval horseshoes from the 1300s and found this exact fibrous structure still intact. The iron had oxidized on the surface, but underneath, the grain structure remained flexible, not brittle. Your modern tools are made from steel that's designed for a specific hardness rating, manufactured to exact specifications, and optimized for initial performance. Nobody's optimizing for year 50. Nobody's planning for your great-grandkids to inherit your hammer. But here's where it gets interesting. Forging methods. A medieval blacksmith didn't pour molten metal into a mold and call it a day. Every tool was hand-forged, which means heated to around 200 degrees Celsius and hammered into shape. And I mean hammered. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of blows to form a single axe head. This wasn't just shaping the metal. Every hammer strike was compressing the grain structure, aligning those iron fibers, work hardening the surface. Modern metallurgists call this mechanical working, and it fundamentally changes the properties of the metal. You're creating a denser, tougher material with every blow. A study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2018 examined Viking Age tools and found the surface hardness was 30–40% higher than the core material, entirely from hammerwork. No fancy heat treatment, just repetitive forging, modern tools. Most are cast or stamped. You pour steel into a mold or cut it from sheet metal with a press. Fast, efficient, cheap. But you're not compressing anything. You're not aligning grain structure. You're just shaping hot metal and hoping it hardens properly when it cools. Then there's the heating process itself. Medieval blacksmiths used charcoal fires, which burned cleaner and hotter than coal. Charcoal fires produce less sulfur contamination, which matters because sulfur makes iron brittle. They were working with bloom iron, smelted in small batches, where they could control the carbon content by eye and experience. Your modern tools are made in industrial furnaces processing tons of steel at once. Quality control is statistical. If 95% of the batch meets spec, that's acceptable. That other 5%? They end up in your toolbox, and you don't know it until the chisel chips on the third use. And the kicker? Medieval blacksmiths reused metal constantly. Every broken tool got melted down and reforged. Every horseshoe, every nail, every scrap went back into the forge. This recycling process actually improved the iron over time, refining it, removing more impurities with each heating cycle. By the time you got a tool made from iron that had been through 5 or 6 recycling cycles, you had metal that was remarkably pure and incredibly tough. We don't do that anymore. It's cheaper to mine new ore and process it industrially than to collect and recycle old tools. So we're working with first-generation steel that hasn't been through those refining cycles. The rust factor. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Medieval tools didn't rust the way yours do, not because the iron was different chemically, but because of how they were maintained and what was on the surface. Every medieval toolmaker knew you had to seal the metal. They used a variety of methods, but the most common was simple: animal fat, lard, tallow, beeswax mixed with oil. You'd heat the tool slightly and rub fat into the surface. The heat would help it penetrate into the microscopic pores of the metal, creating a hydrophobic barrier. A research team at the British Museum analyzed medieval agricultural tools and found traces of animal fats and beeswax still present in the surface layers after 700 years. These organic sealants had carbonized over time, but were still providing some level of protection. But it wasn't just external coating. Remember that wrought iron structure with the slag fibers? Those slag inclusions are mostly silicates, basically glass. When wrought iron corrodes, it forms a stable oxide layer that actually protects the underlying metal. This is called a patina, and it's not the same as rust. Rust on modern steel is iron oxide that flakes off, exposing fresh metal to corrode. Patina on wrought iron is a tight, adherent layer that slows further corrosion. There's a medieval Irish bog tool dated to the 9th century that was submerged in acidic peat for over 1,000 years. When archaeologists pulled it out, there was surface corrosion, sure, but the tool was still structurally intact. The slag fibers had created a protective matrix that kept the iron from complete oxidation. Your modern steel doesn't have that. It's uniform, so when it rusts uniformly. No protective inclusions, no stable patina, just progressive deterioration. And modern tools aren't sealed properly from the factory. Maybe a coat of paint if you're lucky, but paint chips off. Animal fat soaks into metal and stays there. Then there's the maintenance culture. Medieval craftsmen didn't have the option to replace tools easily, so they maintained them religiously. A carpenter in 1450 would clean and oil his tools at the end of every workday. Not sometimes. Not when he remembered. Every single day. Rust didn't get a chance to start because the metal was never exposed to moisture for extended periods. We throw tools in a garage, forget about them for 6 months, then act surprised when they're corroded. Heat treatment. This is where medieval blacksmiths get mystical, because heat treatment in the Middle Ages was part science, part art, and entirely experiential knowledge passed down through apprenticeships. A master blacksmith could tell the temperature of steel by color alone. Dull red meant about 600 degrees Celsius, suitable for tempering. Bright cherry red was around 800 degrees, good for forging. Yellow-white at 1200 degrees meant you were ready to weld. No thermometers, no precise controls, just eyes and experience. And they could temper tools to exact specifications using this method. Tempering is the process of heating hardened steel to a specific temperature to reduce brittleness while maintaining hardness. Get it wrong, and your tool either stays too brittle and chips, or becomes too soft and dulls quickly. Medieval blacksmiths would quench a tool in water or oil to harden it, then carefully reheat just the edge to temper it. They'd watch the colors change as the metal heated, blues and purples appearing on the surface, each color corresponding to a specific temperature and hardness level. For a chisel, you wanted a dark straw color at the edge, about 230 degrees Celsius. For an axe, maybe a brown temper at 260 degrees. A metallurgical analysis of 15th century English carpenters' chisels found the edges had been tempered to a Rockwell hardness of about 5860 HRC, which is exactly where modern tool makers aim for chisel edges. They nailed it without any measuring instruments. Modern heat treatment is done in controlled furnaces with precise temperature regulation, which should be better, right? Except most cheap modern tools aren't heat treated at all. They're through hardened, meaning the entire piece is the same hardness, or they're not hardened enough because proper heat treatment adds cost. I bought a set of chisels from a big box store last year. First time I hit one with a mallet, the edge mushroomed. The metal was too soft. I bought another set from a different manufacturer, same problem. These weren't tempered properly, if at all. They were just stamped steel with a ground edge. Meanwhile, I've got a chisel from the 1920s that I picked up at an estate sale. It holds an edge like nothing modern I own. Someone took the time to forge it, harden it, and temper it correctly. 90 years later, it's still the first tool I reach for. Maintenance culture. Let's talk about something that makes modern consumers uncomfortable. Medieval people took better care of their stuff than we do. A medieval carpenter owned maybe a dozen tools total. A set of chisels, a few planes, a saw or two, an axe, a hammer. That was it. Those tools represented months of a craftsman's wages. Losing a tool or breaking one wasn't an inconvenience, it was a financial disaster. So they maintained them obsessively. Historical records from guild workshops in 15th century Germany show that apprentices spent the first hour of every workday sharpening and oiling tools. Not just their own, but all the shop's tools. This wasn't punishment, it was standard practice. Sharp tools work better, safer, and last longer. An analysis of medieval woodworking tools from an excavated carpenter's workshop in London showed almost no edge damage or improper wear patterns. These tools had been used for decades, possibly over a century, and they'd been maintained so carefully that the edges showed uniform, proper wear, consistent with regular sharpening. Compare that to modern tool use. We buy a drill bit set, use them until they're dull, maybe try to sharpen them once or twice with a bench grinder, probably incorrectly, then throw them away and buy new ones. We don't oil hand tools. We leave them outside, in damp basements, in truck beds exposed to weather. A friend of mine is a carpenter, professional, works every day. I watched him pull a circular saw blade out of his truck that had surface rust on it. Not old rust, fresh rust from being left in the rain. He just wiped it off and kept using it. That blade will last maybe 2 years before it's toast. A medieval craftsman would have been horrified. But here's the thing. Medieval maintenance wasn't just about preserving the tool. It was about preserving the edge geometry. A chisel that's been sharpened properly thousands of times develops a specific bevel angle, a micro bevel at the cutting edge, a profile that's been refined through use. Modern sharpening with power tools removes too much material too fast. You lose that refined geometry. Medieval craftsmen used whetstones, slow and careful. They'd sharpen until they could shave hair off their arm with the tool, then strop it on leather to polish the edge. This created edges that were not just sharp, but durable. The microstructure of the edge was compressed and refined, not torn up by aggressive grinding. There's a Japanese research paper from 2015 that studied traditional knife sharpening methods versus modern mechanical sharpening. The traditionally sharpened edges lasted 40% longer before needing re-sharpening, entirely because of the refined microstructure at the edge. We've lost that culture entirely. We treat tools as consumables, not as investments worth maintaining. The wood handles. Nobody talks about this, but tool handles matter as much as the metal. Medieval tool handles were made from specific woods chosen for their properties. Ash for hammer and axe handles because it's tough and shock absorbent. Beech for plane bodies because it's dense and stable. Apple wood for mallet heads because it's hard and doesn't split. And they didn't just grab a stick and jam it into the tool. Handle making was its own skill. The wood was seasoned for years, sometimes decades, to ensure it was completely dry and stable. Grain orientation mattered. You wanted the grain running parallel to the stress direction, not perpendicular, because wood is 50 times stronger along the grain than across it. A study of medieval axe handles from archaeological contexts found that over 90% had the grain oriented optimally for the stresses that tool would experience. This wasn't luck, it was knowledge. The wood was often soaked in linseed oil or tallow to seal it, prevent moisture absorption, and make it more resistant to splitting. Some craftsmen would char the surface of handles slightly to harden them before fitting them to the tool. Your modern tool handles? Most are made from whatever cheap hardwood was available, dried in kilns to speed the process, and finished with varnish for appearance. The grain orientation is random because nobody's hand-selecting each handle. They crack, they split, they loosen in the socket. I replaced an axe handle last summer. The replacement handle from the hardware store lasted 3 months before it split at the head. The grain was running perpendicular to the stress direction. I bought a piece of ash from a lumber yard, let it dry for 6 months, shaped it myself with the grain running properly, soaked it in linseed oil, and fitted it to the axe. 2 years later, it's still solid. Medieval craftsmen knew this stuff instinctively. We've forgotten it because it's easier to mass-produce handles and accept that they'll fail. Then, there's the wedge. When you fit a handle to a tool head, you drive a wedge into the end of the handle to expand it and lock it in place. Medieval wedges were often made from metal, driven in and peened over to ensure they'd never come loose. Modern wedges are wood, driven in dry, and they shrink over time as they lose moisture. The head loosens. You drive it in again. Eventually, the handle splits from repeated wedging. The British Museum has a collection of medieval carpenters' tools where the original handles are still tight in the sockets after 500 years. The metal wedges are still in place, still holding. We could do this. We just don't, because it takes more time and costs more money. What you can still do. Here's the good news. You don't need to become a medieval blacksmith to benefit from this knowledge. First, stop buying the cheapest tools. I know it's tempting. That 20-piece socket set for $30 looks like a great deal until you strip the first bolt and realize the chrome plating is paper thin and the steel is soft garbage. Buy fewer tools, but buy quality ones. Look for tools that specify the steel type. S2 steel for impact tools, high carbon steel for cutting edges. Read reviews from actual tradespeople, not Amazon's verified purchase bots. Second, maintain what you have. Get a can of 3-in-1 oil or some paste wax and actually use it. Wipe your tools down after use. If they got wet, dry them and oil them immediately. Rust doesn't happen overnight, but if you let moisture sit on steel for a week, you're asking for corrosion. Third, learn to sharpen properly. Buy a set of whetstones or a decent sharpening system and actually learn the technique. YouTube has hundreds of tutorials. A sharp tool is safer and more effective than a dull one. And proper sharpening extends tool life dramatically. Fourth, consider vintage tools. I'm serious about this. Estate sales, antique shops, online auctions, you can find tools from the 1920s, 1960s, made from better steel, with better heat treatment than most modern budget tools. A Stanley Bailey plane from 1950 will outperform a cheap modern plane every time. Clean it up, sharpen it, and you've got a tool that'll last another 70 years. There are entire online communities dedicated to restoring vintage tools. These aren't collectors keeping them in glass cases. These are woodworkers and mechanics using 80-year-old tools daily because they're better than new ones. Fifth, if you're serious, find a blacksmith who does tool restoration or makes custom tools. Yes, they exist. Yes, they're more expensive. But a properly forged hammer or chisel will outlast you. I had a blacksmith reforge an old splitting maul for me. The head was cracked, the handle was shot. He reforged the head, heat-treated it properly, and fitted a new ash handle with a metal wedge. Cost me $120. That maul will split wood long after I'm dead. And finally, change how you think about tools. They're not disposable. They're not meant to be replaced every few years. A good tool, properly made and properly maintained, should last generations. That's not romantic nostalgia. That's historical fact backed by archaeological evidence. The medieval craftsman understood something we've forgotten. The quality of your tools determines the quality of your work and the efficiency of your labor. You can't do precision work with imprecise tools. You can't do heavy work with fragile tools. And you can't pass knowledge down to the next generation if your tools don't last long enough to teach them. We've traded durability for convenience and discovered that convenience is expensive in the long run. Conclusion: medieval tools lasted because they were made by people who understood materials, who had generational knowledge of metallurgy and woodworking, and who had economic incentives to build things that lasted. A blacksmith's reputation depended on his tools, still working decades after he forged them. We've industrialized tool manufacturing and optimized it for profit, not longevity. We've forgotten that wrought iron's fibrous structure made it tough, that hand-forging work hardens metal, that proper heat treatment requires skill and time, that maintenance is cheaper than replacement, and that wood grain orientation matters. But here's what's actually encouraging. All of that knowledge still exists. It's in museum collections, in archaeological studies, in the practices of traditional craftsmen who never stopped doing it the old way. We can learn from it. We can apply it. We can demand better. Your tools rust and snap because we've accepted that as normal. But it's not normal. It's not historical. It's a choice manufacturers made to reduce costs and increase replacement cycles. You can make a different choice. Buy quality, maintain religiously, learn the skills, and those tools will outlast you. If you found this deep dive into medieval tool craftsmanship valuable, hit the like button and subscribe to Medieval Over Modern for more discoveries about what we lost when we stopped looking backward. Drop a comment and let me know if you own any vintage tools that have outlasted modern equivalents, or if you've tried any of these maintenance techniques. Share this with anyone who works with their hands, anyone interested in quality craftsmanship, or anyone tired of buying the same tool 3 times in 5 years. Medieval craftsmen knew something we forgot. The right tool, properly made, lasts forever.